We need practice in our churches with disagreement. If we can't work out our in-house squabbles, we don't have a chance of reaching across cultural dividing lines or being agents of reconciliation anywhere else. This has to start with the family, so to speak. Hello, and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
Nathan, we have, as the kids say today, a bit of a spicy episode, I think.
Drama.
Yes, there is drama. This time in the Anglican Church of America, ACNA, henceforward.
So this isn't really new.
It's not new. And it's possible that this will be on very few of your radars, maybe none of your radars. But there's a conference called the Mere Anglicanism Conference, and it takes place in St. Charles at St. Paul's Cathedral, beautiful church. I've been there myself, absolutely gorgeous. There was a controversy there, and let me just bring you up to speed a little bit on what happened. So one of the speakers at the Mere Anglican Conference this year was, and this conference, by the way, is fantastic. It has a reputation for being excellent, and you always have an excellent lineup of speakers. But the Mere Anglicanism, of course, there's a lot of stress on that mere, would imply that you've got a table with some diverse viewpoints, and that this is a place where you can hear from those diverse voices and a vigorous discussion can follow. All right. So with that in place, with that said, one of the people invited was Friar Calvin Robinson. Calvin Robinson is kind of a new name for me, but he's a bit of a provocateur. So if you look him up, the first thing that will likely show up is a talk he gave at the Oxford Union against gay marriage, which understandably, given that subject, has reached nearly 1 million views.
And that location?
So right. And so Friar Robinson he's very outspoken. He's very intellectually honest. He's a very generous person, but he pulls no punches. And and if you look at any of his talks, that's generally that's the tone he has. He's very upfront, takes no prisoners. He's by no means ungenerous, but he pulls no punches. He did the same thing here at the Mere Anglicanism Conference. He was asked to address the topic of critical theory. Speaking from experience, there's really no uncontroversial way to address this topic, by the way. And he did. I'll say a little bit, and we can get a little bit more into the substance of his talk as we go forward. But essentially, he did talk about critical theory, but his argument was, and I'm just going to give you it in brief, and you will probably immediately see how sparks were flying here. His argument is that the insidious way that critical theory has wormed its way into the Church of England, and that he now sees happening here in the United States, is through feminism. Specifically feminism. And he argues that this is the point of entry. And he now, again, as a conservative Anglican friar, one of his arguments is going to be, he's a complementarian, and he draws an analogy, or really an equivocation. He says, essentially, if somebody makes an argument like, I'm a man trapped in a woman's body, or I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, it's not too far from such a statement to, I'm a woman called to be a priest. So in his words, that is an ontological impossibility. So and those are his words. And so just to give you an idea of how strongly worded this is, it's very clear. And again, the tone is not disrespectful. It's direct, I would say. So a lot of that. Well, after he gave the talk, the gentleman who was the MC came up and was very Anglican about it, sort of chuckled and said, wow, those are some strong views, and we don't necessarily, and made a few jokes and tried to made sort of lighthearted. But then complaints started rolling in online, lots of complaints. And so Friar Robinson was then called into he was called into the office of the people who were leading the conference and told that he was now disinvited from any of the other events, participating in any of the other events. He was supposed to sit on a panel discussion. He was taken off the panel. So effectively, he was canceled at this conference. And that, in turn, as you might imagine, led to its own wave of backlash from people who wanted to hear more from him and felt that this was a violation of the conference's commitment to mere Anglicanism. And so many interviews have since been happening with Friar Robinson and lots of debriefs about that. He wrote about it on his Substack. I'll include a link to that here as well, by the way, because on the Substack you can also read, he has this transcript for his talk, and it's worth looking that through.
Mm-hmm.
So we thought we would talk about it because we're just reaching a juncture right now where it is becoming more and more difficult to come down clearly on certain issues without this kind of upheaval. And we need to be thinking constructively about a way forward, because as Christianity, to use Nathan's words here, as Christianity begins to look more weird in the eyes of our surrounding culture, we are going to have to think about how we're going to do when we have to maintain positions that make us look weird and possibly make us look worse than weird to people. We need to talk through what that looks like. And so I think this provides a really good opportunity to kind of think in that direction.
Cameron, it's also a little interesting, and perhaps maybe we wouldn't have jumped right in on this conversation, except Stuart was there. So Thinking Out Loud's own Stuart McAllister was there in the audience. We had a chance to talk to him about kind of how he saw some of this.
Just kidding.
Yeah, our correspondent. Yes, thank you, everybody, for supporting our correspondent at the Mere Anglican Conference. He wasn't speaking. He was there. But the other thing is, if you look at the panel and the speakers, I know 5 out of 9 of them. Pretty heavily old RZIM connections and folks there as well. So there's a sense in which it's interesting because this is not hypothetical for us. We know people involved in this, but also, even if you're not Anglican or don't really even care, I guarantee you that if you're a part of a church that's a denomination, there are similar conversations that are going on, happening, or controversies where the question isn't necessarily even what are the degrees of the disagreement, but do we still have the language and the culture that enables us to have those conversations and disagreements? Certainly people are going to feel like their feelings are hurt in multiple directions here, but we kind of have to talk about it because it's a big thing.
Yeah, and one of the points that Friar Robinson makes in his talk that I think is helpful here, it's worth bearing in mind, is that people want Christianity to be more inclusive. And he points out, from one perspective, it is inclusive. It could not be more inclusive. Everybody is invited to the table. But he points out what's often meant by inclusive is people want to be affirmed in their sin. And again, this is these are his words, but I would fully endorse what he's saying here. I think he's right. People want to, by inclusivity, particularly people who represent some of these whether this person identifies as gay or trans, many people do want to be affirmed in their sin. So it's not just I want to see it at the table. Christianity, of course, invites everybody to the table, but the truth there, the little soundbite there, is that the good Lord, loves you too much to leave you the way you are. You're coming and you are falling down at the feet of Christ, surrendering your life to him and surrendering to him, and then you take up your cross. And that requires, it's a path of self-sacrifice for everybody, every single person.
Yeah.
Not just somebody who struggles with their identity or their sexuality. All of us. And all of us struggle with
access
our identity.
Access isn't
in
comfy
different
for
ways.
anyone.
No, absolutely not. For some people, it's pride. Pride happens to be one of those things that is so incredibly dangerous and insidious, and yet it gets a pass in many churches because it just doesn't make the list of exotic cultural sins, and yet it's a massive problem. So I'm just pointing out, Christianity is an equal opportunity offender when it comes to inviting you to self-sacrifice. But I think he's right. A lot of people, when they talk about inclusivity, there's a desire for the clear want is for the church to look more like the surrounding culture and then affirm lifestyles that we would recognize as sinful. So, yes, in that sense, it is exclusive, not in the sense that it's turning anybody away, but in the sense that it's saying if you want to follow Jesus as Lord, self-sacrifice will be required and you must surrender to him. So I think it's worth bearing that in mind, regardless of what you think of his, And again, the argument, I think if you use the word feminism now, it's already going to people, the hairs on the back of their head, necks are going to stand up, and it gets attention. But if you look through his full argument, he does make a compelling case for the ways in which some of these arguments have been used to erase essential differences between, in this case, men and women, and how that then translates to a whole different kind of behavior and a kind of philosophy when it comes to your approach of how the sacraments are handled, how church authority is handled. So a lot of really hot button issues there. But once again, let's not get lost in the weeds of the arguments he's making so much. One of the things my dad said here, and we can get lost in those weeds later on, of course. And if you want to write it and talk about it, we can. But one of the observations my dad made, we do. That's what we do. But one of the observations my dad made was, right now, I want to push to the side the substance of his talk. And my dad, by the way, thought his talk actually had a lot of was pretty good. But he said, I want to push to the side the arguments he was making in his talk, and just consider his right to make those arguments at this conference, which was effectively denied him after he had given the talk. I think that's what we want to look at for a little bit here.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe I wouldn't I don't know if I would use the word rights, but his right to, but you do have a sense in which there were some ironies, two big ironies in this, I think. And also, Bethel McGrew wrote an article on this for World Magazine, which, if you're curious in this story and you have access to World, you might be interested in looking at. And she's, I think, Cameron and I would say, somebody who's usually pretty level-headed and perhaps would disagree with him on some things, but on the structural part of how the conference worked out, would point this out. So the first oddity / irony / irritation is that there was a misunderstanding on what he was invited to speak on. So he said, if I'd been just invited to speak on critical theory, I wouldn't have come. I'm not just another brown skin token, person to come and speak on this topic. So some people thought, you're just going to speak on critical theory and that's that. But what he did is he said
critical race theory. Yeah.
Critical race theory. Yeah. Is that, so he went critical theory broader than critical race theory. And I think there's a desire perhaps within the church that you invite a speaker to say, hey, we want you to come and critique everything that's happening out there. And Calvin Robinson shows up and says, well, here's a form of critical theory that's alive and well here. And so what the audience is expecting to hear, is to say, hey, the problem's out there. And he suddenly takes the thing that they're all against and says, actually, no, there's a alive and well version of it here within our own conversation. So yes, that's definitely going to ruffle feathers. But then the other, irony, I guess is the right word, is that the panel that he was no longer on then did discuss cancel culture as a problem. So I guess that's where a lot of people would say, whether or not you thought his talk was abrasive or not. And it's also sort of like inviting a bulldog to your chicken house and then getting surprised that the chickens get chased. I mean, if anybody had glanced at, which I'm sure they have, his style and background and what he does, there shouldn't have been any surprises there. But it's almost like the conference invited somebody who's a disruptor who came and disrupted, and then they ended up doing the thing that they thought was the problem with the broader culture.
It reminds me a bit of when people would invite Ricky Gervais to do the Golden Globe Awards. And then afterwards, there would be all this hand-wringing about how incredibly offensive he was to everybody in the audience. And of course, that's why, why are you going to invite Ricky Gervais? This is what he does. He sits there and insults people and makes it incredibly uncomfortable. That's his whole MO. And again, similarly here, Nathan said it well. But the reason I was using rights language is not in the broader sense, but just when it comes to a conference like this, devoted ostensibly to a diversity of perspectives, and you invite somebody, and I'm assuming that the people doing the inviting are perceptive.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Listeners and readers, and we're able to gather from, right. And so, but the leadership at doing the inviting, I'm assuming that when they looked at Calvin Robinson's, his talks and the general tone, and that they could see, this man can be polemical at times and is somewhat of a provocateur. He's very clear. He takes no prisoners. And so he will clearly ruffle some feathers. What I think happened here, Nathan, is I think that was understood. And I think that was known. I think what happened was when the complaints started coming in, that they began to waver in their commitment, and they wavered on their decision. That's just, and again, that's pure speculation on my part, but I think that's what happened. I think they knew that what they were getting into when they invited him, but they didn't realize that that some people would be quite that offended. And so then they made an unwise and hasty decision. So it could have been a much more interesting conference if they. So on that panel, some of the questions that were coming up were clearly arising from his talk. I mean, he would have been a very helpful presence there and an interesting counterbalance to some of the perspectives, which again would go along with the mere part. But I think, Nathan, we're still. How do I say this? This is literally thinking out loud. So just bear with me for a second. There are certain, this is going to sound weird, and this is very in-house baseball. So if you're an outsider listening in on the fence, this may run this will just sound weird. I mean, you're hearing dispatches from a subculture here, right? So within certain strands of theologically conservative Christianity in America, some are cooler than others. Okay? Just meaning some of them, okay, and so just bear with me here. Some of them look a little bit more culturally relevant than others. Some of them are a little bit more fashionable than others, okay? And this sounds condescending. I'm trying not to sound condescending. I'm trying to just speak descriptively. And also speaking as somebody who often feels the tug of wanting to be accepted and wanting to be seen as cool. So I am not no sage on a mountaintop looking down. This is somebody who has an insider's perspective on this. Trust me. But I pick it up a lot, Nathan, in tone is very carefully guarded. None of this is really spelled out so clearly. It's often sort of this, there's an unwritten kind of book of rules on how one conducts oneself here. So Christianity Today, for instance, is a publication right now that I think styles itself as a cool version of Christianity. I don't know if cool is the best word here, but you see what I'm saying? It has palatable, has some very harsh and prophetic. Yes, sure. Yeah, there you go. I mean, it's got some very harsh and prophetic language for a lot of other Christians. Russell Moore is in the business of writing. I mean, goodness, he's most of his articles are against evangelicals. So, I mean, he's got a steady, barrage of material, an arsenal of material that he draws on him. And some of these are needed critiques. Sometimes you think, okay, this is becoming just like a little bit of a cottage industry here. So there's a good deal of that happening. But in these circles, a conciliatory tone, particularly when it has to do with liberalism or progressive topics, is seen as very imperative. I think in the best of circumstances, it's missional. It's seen as missional to do that. It's seen as intellectual hospitality, and that's fine. But in its worst instantiations, it ends up becoming a form of fear. I'm tempted almost to say cowardice. And again, I'm speaking from an inside perspective. This is not me pointing fingers, but an unwillingness to actually state baldly what we really think on controversial topics, and then to try to hide behind some sort of principle of either being, I don't want to be polemical, or I'm not a culture warring type. But if it's a matter of grave importance, which complementarianism is for Friar Robinson, then clarity is important. And so in that sense, I don't think he's being a provocateur here. I think he's speaking very clearly and very courageously, and he's willing to say things that offend people. He's not trying to offend people, but he's willing to do it in order to get them to think. And that's something, if you're a kind of cool Christian, and I want to suggest that if you're a person who's a little bit more intellectual, you like to think things through, you're a reader, you're a little bit more, you like the life of the mind, your tendency is probably to be a cool Christian. And by that, also another way of looking at it is to say, if you're a cool tending or Christian, there's a distinct temptation to sort of say some version of, I'm not like those other Christians. You may have met some Christians, but I'm not like those Trump supporting, misogynistic guys, Christian nationalists. I'm just picking some of the words out of the handbag right now of things you don't want to be called if you're a cool Christian. Definitely don't want to be called you don't want to be a Trumpist. You definitely don't want to be a Christian nationalist. These are all really bad designations. So, but Reinhold Niebuhr, interestingly enough, himself, no evangelical whatsoever. I mean, talk about a, dyed in the wall mainliner, right? Union Theological Seminary, but also talk about an absolutely brilliant intellect, amazing writer. He was very big on not drawing that line of, I'm not like other Christians. Very big on the brotherhood and sisterhood of believers of the church. Yes, you are part of this church, and these people who embarrass you are indeed your brothers and sisters in Christ. And to try to push yourself away from that isn't right. I thought that carried great weight coming from somebody of his, again, cultural and intellectual stature and influence. But does any of this make sense to you, Nathan?
Yeah, but so here's the thing that I think if I could detect a hint of sadness in your dad and Stuart's voice as he was talking about this, is he was saying, if this conversation can't happen here, where could it actually happen? So I think it's the loss of the ability to communicate without people immediately jumping to the worst assumptions about other people's motives. That's the thing to lament here. They're saying, actually, this wasn't an evangelistic conference. This was a time to speak the truth in love was the title, and to work some stuff out internally. And there was massive disagreement there. So sometimes when you have people who come out of the gate swinging like that, it really highlights a disconnect and a disunity that already existed. He didn't create any disunity there. He highlighted what already existed. And so I think there's a sorrow that comes out of some of these types of meetings where people say, you know what, really, it's not mere, it's complex, and we aren't nearly as unified as we thought we were because we have some foundationally or fundamental differences in the way in which we interpret what's essential and what's secondary. So anytime that somebody comes and kind of flips on the light switch or rips off the Band-Aid and shows the true depth of the wound, there's going to be people running and screaming in every direction.
Now, it stands to reason if I were, so I'm not an egalitarian. But I am I'm tempted to use the word reluctant. I'm not going to use the word reluctant. I'm going to use the word surrendered.
You once told me you were a complementarian because your wife told you to be.
There you go. Yeah, there you go. Therein lies the whole balance, right? I am a surrendered complementarian. I mean, I just in the spirit of intellectual honesty, I was telling Nathan about this earlier. I have some good friends who are egalitarian, and so not only do I value their perspective, I wanted to hear it, and I wanted all the best arguments too, and they did. They sent me phenomenal arguments, very sophisticated, some of them exegetical, some of them drawing deeply from the wells of church history. So this was great. And by the way, I'm also open to correction. I'm committed to complementarianism. I do think it's the position that best honors Scripture and squares with what I find there. But I could be wrong, and I'm okay admitting that. But my point here, Nathan, is I feel a strong pull toward egalitarianism because that's the direction I would personally like to go. My commitment to what I find in God's word forbids me to do so. But that said, if I were an egalitarian, I would want to hear the counter perspective. I mean, whatever positions I hold, I like to hear the counter perspectives, and I like to hear the best, the strongest arguments I can. And I like those vigorous conversations. Sometimes they can feel like a threat sometimes because, yes, it's always disorienting to have your assumptions challenged, but it's good for us. And that was an opportunity for many people who didn't share, Calvin Robinson's perspective, which is just fine. They didn't share it, but it was it was an opportunity where vigorous conversations could have happened. That one would think is an ideal venue for that conversation. And the fact that it was short circuited is unfortunate. So yeah, that's kind of, I would go along with my dad there. That's true.
Yeah. So we want to be able to affirm people who say things boldly without sounding like we're cheering for or affirming the culture warriors who are just out there to make a mess. I like a phrase my dad once used. He said, there are people who rock the boat because they want to see real change. And there are people who rock the boat because they like to hear the people scream. And and there's a difference there, right? And so that's I think a good balance for us to keep in the back of our mind is there will always have to be the disruptors which was the Old Testament. I mean, you think about like the role of the prophets in the Old Testament. You have Amos, and this is what's wrong with this nation, and Israel cheers, and this is what's wrong with that nation, and Israel cheers, and this is what's wrong with that nation, and Israel cheers, and then he's like, and this is what's wrong with you. And you're like, so there is that prophetic sense in which if we want to genuinely have something robust to say in critique of the broader culture around us, we do need people to help us see when we have a bit of a plank in our own eye going forward, or even to raise the question in order for us to be a healthy organization. As your dad was talking about it, I was thinking, one of the things that I love about Thinking Out Loud and the people who write to us, and for those of you who have asked, we are fervently working on putting together some sort of online forum where you guys can meet and interact and discuss things on the topic of whatever the podcast or whatever else is going on. So keep your eyes and ears out for that. But I do think the thing that I really appreciate about the interactions that we do get to have with you guys is you are people who I would hope disagree with us sometimes, especially when we're wrong. But that's seen as a healthy part of really wrestling with the heart of a matter and the heart of an issue and gaining clarity for the sake of the goodness of the truth in and of itself. And so we don't have, if you want to know something about the other people who listen to Thinking Out Loud, we don't have a lot of like, that's it, I'm taking my marbles and leaving. You guys, where you find us to be, off base, usually write in and say, hey, I appreciate it's been helpful to me, but have you considered this? What about this? And so that I think is something that Cameron and I hope to and do model in the disagreements that we have between each other, but also in the way in which we model the tone in which we have those. So, good on you. Thanks for the way you are.
Yes, indeed. I want to echo that. We're very grateful for that, and we do not take that for granted. And along those lines, I think those of us who, just if you're a Christian right now, we need to be prayerfully and creatively thinking about spaces where we can have these kinds of vigorous discussions within the church. Because here's the thing, and this is Bethel McGrew points this out in her piece, and she's right about it. She's talking about conservative Anglicans, but this is going to be true of, all theologically conservative Christians. She basically says if we can't work out these crucial issues, the issue in question here, of course, for her is complementarianism, but we all have those crucial issues. Just about every theologically conservative denomination has some issue that's a real bone of contention. If we can't work those out in-house, we're certainly not going to be agents of reconciliation in the broader culture. If we can't have these kinds of conversations in our churches, in our conferences, among friends, among brothers and sisters in Christ, what hope have we of, reaching across cultural dividing lines? That's simply a fantasy. We've got to figure out how to, and again, not all on our own resources. We're going to need the empowerment of Christ's Holy Spirit to do this. But that's why I said prayerfully and creatively in our communities, ideally probably smaller groups, and many of them probably informal, meet together for vigorous disagreements and learn how to do it well. The only way, practice makes perfect. That's the only way to do it. It's not, and will it lead to some uncomfortable moments? Oh yeah. Will you have some moments where the person will text you back for a little while? Probably. But you know what? It's good for you. We need to do that. We've got to figure out how to do this in-house before we start going to the broader culture and telling everybody, here's how you get along. Why don't we start getting along first? It's going to take a little work. But by God's grace, we can do it.
Yeah, but here's where I think it gets challenging, Cameron, is that so last year I was at a conference, probably in the leadership of this conference, there was probably about 30 people. As a denominational conference, about 30 people in a room, and it was like a get to know you kind of thing where you sat in chairs across from each other. It's kind of like speed dating, but theologically, and you just had questions to get the group to know each other before we did a week of work together. And one of the questions was, do you think people are essentially good? And the guy across from me, we were like, no. And everybody else in the room said yes. And somebody's like, but so it wasn't, so there were 2 of us that out of 30 were like, wait a second, we're seeing things very differently than everybody else here. And then what was wild is all the people who came up afterward and said, why would you say that? And I'm like, well, I'm just actually quoting Jesus. And then like the guy beside me started preaching the gospel to this lady. But it's like a sense of like, why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone. Like that's right out of the mouth of Jesus. And so you have those
if you
moments
who are evil know how to give good gifts to your children.
It's like that's pretty much one of the fundamental doctrines of for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But you have those moments where you're like, by not having robust conversations, people end up believing a wide variety of things within the same group, but they've never had a clear conversation on it. And so they just think that everybody agrees with them. And then you have these moments where it's like getting punched in the eyes where you recognize like, I don't fit in here. And I think that actually is
Nathan, you see how...
Yeah, go ahead.
But it goes back to that goes back to that cool Christian thing again. Because, I mean, if cool Christianity is all about fitting in and it's all about catering to people's sensibilities in essence. So that happens in churches too. Well, we don't go after those hot button issues because we just don't want to have that kind of atmosphere in our church. We don't want to get all hung up on those. I mean, there are bigger fish to fry. We don't want to. But again, so to a certain extent, I get that. So sometimes when that's come up with me, for instance, age of the earth is one of those questions where people will say, this shouldn't be something that stops us from worshiping together. And I agree. But occasionally, maybe you should hash out age of the earth. Maybe there is a time to talk about that. Or some of those, because for some people, that's a crucial dividing line. And if it is a crucial dividing line, it's worth a discussion, and it should be addressed sometimes from the pulpit as well. So I'm just saying those conversations, we don't know. Sometimes those arrive as total shocks to us because we have these really inane approaches to sermons that go for a kind of, and Anglicanism is notorious for being bland on stuff, right? Just, middle of the line. We're going to be very elegant, and we're going to elegantly say, just almost nothing at all with just enough substance to carry people through. Now that's a caricature, and that's not totally fair. But the truth is, if you're in the cool club, you're tempted often to do that, to speak in really broad terms, and you sound more like a politician than a priest.
So we use the phrase "sweep things under the rug," and
right.
And maybe that's a bit of a crude analogy, but actually I can make it worse. So let me give you a cultural reference from 80 years ago. So there's this Three Stooge episode where the Three Stooges are laying carpet. Cameron's making faces already. And I think Larry and Curly are
he's so culturally relevant. He's mentioning the Three Stooges.
They're nailing down the outside perimeter of the rug, and Mo crawls under the rug to get something and ends up getting nailed down under the rug. I mean, this is classic Three Stooges. And then Larry and Curly notice there's this huge lump in the rug, and they decide they're going to hammer it out flat. And so, they're hammering on this lump, and then finally Mo comes tearing out as he would, and they say, "Mo, you was that lump." But at a certain point, if you sweep enough stuff under the rug, you're going to have a lump that is so large that the room is unusable. And that seems to be what, we're not going to talk about that. Oh, we're not going to talk about that. Oh, we're not going to talk about that. Like, just keep sweeping under the rug, and then you have a massive lump that at some day is going to pop one way or the other. So I hate confrontation by personality. Yeah. But I've been inspired by...
I don't like it either, yeah.
Yeah. Todd Bolsinger has a phrase in church leadership that he talks about peacemongers, who are people who prioritize unity over truth. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to be careful there. We're used to the concept of warmongers, as like people who really love to fight and go out there and get it. But he said that a peacemonger can be as dangerous to a congregation as a warmonger, because you're prioritizing a sense of unity over truth, and then you're skipping over massive truths that really do have a big implication on your identity and your life together. So I'm working on that.
Well, I am too. Yeah, absolutely. I definitely have pronounced peacemonger tendencies myself. But another one quick, I think this is a good fitting kind of point of closure, and it comes from Calvin Robinson. I think this was a helpful little thing he said. It's not original to him. Others have said it before as well, but he's right. He points out, we're very concerned with being nice. And niceness is something we've talked about before on the Thinking Out Loud podcast.
Oh, yeah, we did
And
have a nice
This goes
podcast.
along with the coolness. We had a nice podcast. He said the church often, particularly Anglicans, get obsessed with being nice. Stanley Hauerwas had a similar comment about Methodists once. You know, he's a Methodist. He said, here's one thing I figured out about Methodists is that we all think Jesus is really nice. But he said, Calvin, Robinson says, niceness versus kindness. Niceness is worldly. Kindness is heavenly. And kindness is not peace-mongering. Kindness will tell somebody the truth, even if that truth is an affront to them, not in an effort to hurt them. And there are unkind ways to be truthful, and we're not endorsing that. But there are also times where it's impossible to be truthful without hurting somebody's feelings. And to that, we have to say, so be it at times. We all know this from life experience. You don't have to limit your thoughts to the church for this. Dealing with family members, dealing with children, dealing with a conflict in a friendship or a relationship. Or maybe, the temptations these days are just to, put Mo under the carpet and nail it down, or write the person off entirely, not deal with it, write them off as a toxic person, walk away from them entirely, rather than. So I think avoiding confrontations is a huge problem for a lot of us. Mm-hmm. But we need to become aware of what real peace doesn't ignore the truth, and it doesn't ignore those important points of difference, honors them by taking them seriously. Ignoring them doesn't take them seriously. Honoring somebody's actual views is to when you disagree with somebody respectfully and robustly, you are honoring their perspective. You're taking it seriously. I need to remember that. I need reminders of that. And so it's helpful to bear in mind that niceness is worldly and kindness is heavenly. I think I'll have that in my head for a little while here.
Well, you've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, the podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.